These are my two Sauvie Sundresses from Soho 7. So gorgeous. This one is made from a mood fabric that I had, and then this one is from Minerva. Just absolutely gorgeous. Floaty, easy to wear. Let's talk a little bit about the construction. This, I'm 5'2". I made the midi length, and I just turned the hem so it is right at above my ankle. This has side slits, which I absolutely love. I extended the lining, so this is all self-lined, which is amazing because there's no facings, which I love. So it doesn't, there's nothing that's going to pop out. But what I did was I extended the lining so I don't have to wear a slip, because this is a little sheer. This one's super sheer. This one is a little sheer. So the lining now finishes off my neck edges and my armholes, but it also goes down to about here. So it's long enough to cover whatever I need to cover and stays in place. I suggest you get the Sauvie Sundress from Soho 7 and make it up. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do on the front and the back pieces is to do a row of stay stitching. And what the stay stitching does is it takes this piece that's cut on the bias and it stabilizes it. So essentially you want to do it around the armholes and then the neck edge of the front and the back. And it's just a stitch that runs, you know, with inside the seam allowance. It's just a straight stitch on a single layer, and that will keep this from stretching out, because you don't want it to stretch out before you get the lining attached to it to keep it secure. If this stretches and the lining doesn't stretch and they end up being different lengths because one is stretched out, you're going to get this wavy finish. So if you've ever done a collar and the neckline comes out wavy, part of it is because it's stretched out, and that could be, you know, one of the reasons. The next thing we're going to do after that is put the dart in the front, in our front piece and in our front lining. So I'm going to make sure that I mark the darts, and I don't use chalk, I use pins. You certainly can go ahead and use some kind of chalk. Just make sure that it doesn't affect your fabric. I'm going to find my size here on this chart and put a pin into the circle for my size. And then I'm going to put a pin. This crotch is here. I know that crotch is there, but I'm going to put a pin here at the top where I need that crotch to meet. And obviously this point on the dart is going to make a point, so it should come out fine, but you can certainly put a pin there. Then what I want to do is I'm going to lift up the paper to find my pin. My pin came out. There we go. I'm going to lift up the paper to find my pin and actually add a pin into the fabric. So you can see the pin there, and then I can take this pin out of the paper. And I'm gonna do the same thing on this side. I'm gonna put a pin where that notch is. You really don't wanna cut into the seam allowance because it compromises the structure of the seam allowance, so that's not a good thing. So now I have a pin at that point of my dart, and I have a pin up here at the top. And if you want, you can certainly put a pin down here too. Now it's only on one side, right? So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to put a second pin right in the same hole where these pins are. Now what I've done is marked the dart on the left and right side of my front, and when I open this up, both of my darts are marked on the back with pins. So at this point, it's pretty simple. You want to work from the back side, and you want to fold the dart so the sides, these two pins come together, and the sides meet, and this triangle is a nice point. I'm going to take those pins out. So I've met up those two pins at this crotch here, and that my dart comes to a nice point. And I'm going to go down to this one pin I have, last pin here, which is the point where my dart is. point where my dart is, here where this pin is, and put another pin in there. So now I have my dart marked. What you can do, so I want to start sewing here at the tip and sew super, super skinny for a little bit and then get wide till I come out to this point. So if you need a line, certainly make one. If you can press this also before you sew it with the pins in it, if you use these glass head pins, you can press over them and you can press this, and then it's much easier to stitch this dart line here. I go against convention. I backstitch just one stitch here just to kind of lock it at the beginning. But again, you go super, super skinny right here at the beginning before you start getting wide. If you get wide too soon, or if you sew kind of like in a loop from the beginning, you're gonna get like a dimple, and you don't want that. You want it to be smooth. You don't want to see it, essentially. You just want it to gather the fabric. So I do that you can do that on both sides of the fashion fabric and also for your lining piece. So go ahead and construct your darts and make sure that you do the stay stitching on the neckline and the sleeve openings for the front and the back. So here is my lining piece. I opted to make my lining longer because this fabric is a little sheer. So I made the lining pretty much as long as the base of the pocket. I cut it to, I used the same pieces that I used for the front and the back. They do have separate pieces for the lining, and you certainly can use them. But I cut it to this increase-decrease length. That is actually, you can see it's just, here's the pocket. So I cut my lining to here. That way I don't need to wear a slip, because I'm already fully lining the top. So it saves me from, packing a slip or having to go look for one. So the next thing we wanna do is we wanna stabilize our neckline, and we're gonna do that by sewing, this is neck interfacing piece 10. This is my front, and I'm going to apply my interfacing, my iron-on interfacing to the neckline for my front piece. And that will help stabilize that. Now this is a knit lining. It's what I had, and it's comfortable. I like the way it fits. So I used a knit tricot interfacing. Certainly, even if this is a woven, I would use the tricot because this is cut on a bias and it's gonna move. I don't want my lining to separate from my fabric, but I almost always use this tricot. I sell it in my Etsy shop. You can buy it at various stores. It's a little bit easier to find than it used to be. It used to be very difficult to find. It's an iron-on tricot. It's perfect, and it stretches. I use it on everything except heavy coats because you need some interfacing with some structure. But I use it on cotton shirts. I use it pretty much on jackets. I use it pretty much on everything unless I need a really heavyweight interfacing, because you can see this is super lightweight. Right? It's not stiff at all, and it's stretchy, so it moves when the fabric moves. I moved on to the pocket assembly, and this assembly is going to be for pocket B, but there'll be a cutaway after I put this pocket in for pocket A, which I did on my sample dress. Both pockets are super cute. So this is your pocket facing, view 6, piece 6, and then the pocket piece 7. And what we're gonna do is we're going to take our front piece, and we have this little cutout notch here on the front, and we're going to lay our pocket facing on top of that, matching up the side edges and this curved edge here. I'm just gonna pin this down. So we're gonna sew this curved seam 3/8 of an inch. So I've done this one on this side. You can see that I've sewn this seam allowance 3/8 of an inch, and then I've finished it. And the next step is to clip this seam. So what I'm gonna do is just cut to, but not through that stitch, mostly around the curve.
And what that does is it releases some of the tension on the seams and it gives it a place to go, because we're going to turn this to the inside because it is the facing. So when you press it, you've stitched it. Now we're going to press it flat like this. Then I'm going to press the pocket and the seam allowance in the same direction, and then we're going to understitch, which means we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to stitch along the pocket facing side, and we're going to stitch the pocket facing to the seam allowance. And what that does is that anchors that together, and it will help give us a gorgeous turn on our pocket. So that will lie super flat once I've finished pressing it and understitching it. And then we'll come back and we'll put the pocket on. All right, so here is our pocket, and you can see I have understitched it. I stitched the pocket facing to the seam allowance so they're connected together. And when you press it, you end up with this lovely pocket finish, right? And you want to make sure that the edges of this facing pocket, when you press it, that the edges of this facing pocket line up with the edges of your side seams, because that's where it's going to be captured. You don't want to have any kind of folds or bumps here, which is easy to do. You have to pay attention when you're ironing. Now that we have our pocket facing on and pressed, we're going to take our pocket piece and lay it on top, matching up the edges and the side seams, and pin just the pocket to the facing. We're not pinning it to the dress. We're just pinning it to each other. Pin that all the way around and stitch it at 3/8 of an inch. So you're going to have, it's going to be separate from the dress. And this is what it looks like. And you can panic now and you're like, oh no, I have this big floppy thing, but it's all good. So we've pressed it, we've stitched it, and we've pressed it. And now we really want to make sure that we line it up with our side seams. So we have the pocket facing, and the side of our dress, and they all line up together, because now this part of the pocket is actually going to work as our side seam. So you want to look at the front and make sure this lies beautiful. This is where our hand goes in. And then we're going to look at the back and make sure that these all line up nicely. And you're just going to baste this section that's flopping around here. You're going to baste it to the side seam, and the same thing up at the top. We're going to baste this down to make sure that they stay in place. That way, when I go to sew my side seams together, I don't have to worry about this getting caught or turned around. And then that's all there is to the pockets, and they're done, and those are beautiful. So the next thing we're going to do is turn our attention to the straps. And we have, this is piece 8. Looks like this, right? And we cut it, make sure you cut it on the grain line. This one you want to make sure, because it's a strap, you don't want it on the bias for sure. We're going to fold it right sides together along the long edge and stitch that. So we're making a strap. Nothing too fancy there. And this is what we end up. So now make sure you do a little back stitch back and forth on that, because you're going to be turning it inside right. And this takes a few minutes. All right, so now my strap is turned inside right and the seam is on the inside. And I'm just going to press it so this seam is towards the back for a couple of reasons. It gives it a little more structure because you have that seam there, and I think there's no really good way to press it to the side without seeing it. And this is going to go over your shoulder. So we're going to press that, and the straps are done. All right, we're going to take a break from our other dress, and this is my practice garment. I want to show you how to make pocket A, if you want to use that on your dress instead. And this pocket is stitched down, so there's a slash in here. This is my side seam, and this a slash for the pocket, and then the pocket is stitched all the way down around the back. So there's only 2 pieces for this. There is piece 5, which is this little pocket facing. So we've cut one of those and we finished the outside edge of that. And then the pocket, which is piece 7, And again, we finished the outside edge of that. The first step, let's do this on the other side, is to line up this cut section, this groove where the pocket is. We're gonna line this up, right sides together, and you want to be careful to make sure that your edges come together, because you don't, see how there's a gap? I know it's hard with the white, but there's a gap here. We don't want that, because when this turns over, it needs to hit the seam allowance. So we're going to pin this edge, pin it around to the other side, and stitch it. So they ask you to use a 3/8 of an inch. Oops, let me get that on. They suggest use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on this seam. So I am going to stitch around this pocket facing edge here at 3/8 of an inch. So here's my pocket facing seam, and you need to clip these corners so the facing will turn. I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna clip through the seam allowance, but not to the seam. Just around this facing. These pockets are pretty quick, as long as you pay attention to what you're doing, they're fine. So now I'm gonna take this to the iron, I'm gonna press this flat, and then I'm going to press it out because I want to understitch this facing. So you can see I've pressed the facing and the seam allowance away from the garment. Both of them are pressed away from the garment, and there's a curve here, so you want to be careful. What we're going to do is we're going to understitch. So essentially we're going to stitch the facing to the seam allowance, and that keeps it from rolling. It gives us this really nice seam here. See how beautiful that edge is? That's because I understitched there. And it just gives it a really nice roll. My fabric, you can see it actually through the other fabric. So I'm hoping once I line it, because I'm doing a full lining in this, you won't see it as much, but you're going to see it. So keep that in mind. If you have kind of a cream background, you might want to consider making your pockets, cutting your pockets in such a way that you don't see that. But it couldn't be helped. This was all the fabric I had, and I'm okay with it. So now I'm going to go ahead and understitch this. And after I do that, I'm going to go back to my iron and press this. And when I do, I want to make sure that the edge of my facing is in the same place as my side seam. All right, so here's my edge stitching. I stitched the facing to the seam allowance, and then I rolled this back on itself and pressed it. And I want to make sure that when I do that, I get this really nice curve here at the bottom. It would be very easy to just press it and end up with something like this that's kind of flat and wonky, because it sort of tends to pull itself that way. And you don't want it. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you get this nice curve at the top and at the bottom, and also that your facing edge and your side seam match. Now, so now I have this, I want to make sure this is pressed really well, because once I stitch this in place, it's not going anywhere. And this is a super light fabric. I don't want to have to rip it out. Now I'm going to top stitch this, and I'm the facing in place. I'm going to stitch it from the wrong side, because my bobbin stitch looks just as good as my top stitch, and if yours doesn't, it should. But it's much easier for me to just follow the edge of this overlocking all the way around, and then I know it's stitched perfectly. I can keep an eye on this edge to make sure it's about the same, but I want this flat, because when I add my pocket in and I sew it down, it's gonna be sewn to the front of the dress. I want to make sure that everything is super, super wrinkle free. All right, so I've stitched this facing down. You can see it from the front. It still needs to be pressed. And give yourself some leeway. Go take this to the iron and press it. It will help alleviate some of these, see these little ripples here? you can see them, the pressing will help alleviate some of that. So I'm not too worried about that. So I'm going to press this, then I'm going to make sure the front of the dress is super well pressed, as the pocket is super well pressed. And then there's marks on the pocket, these 2 marks, there's one up here and one down here. Those marks correspond to this opening that we just created. So I'm going to put the pocket face down, right side of the pocket to the wrong side of the dress, because think about that, you want to see the right side of the pocket from the front, and we're only doing 1 layer. So I'm going to line up my notches with the opening of my pocket facing here. And again, you want to make sure that the edge of this pocket lines up with your side seam. That's important. I'm going to line this one up, same thing. I want to make sure that they're all nice and neat. And again, pressing will help with this. You can do this at the ironing board. And then lay this out super flat. See, I have a ridge there, so I want to make sure all of that's taken care of before I sew this. So I'm going to take it to the iron and do that. And then I'm going to sew following the overlocking all the way around the pocket. So I'm sewing through the pocket and the front of the dress. And what I'm going to end up with is, you can see that the pocket is sewn here to the front of the dress. So if you look at the front of the dress, you can actually see 2 layers of fabric on mine. All right, you can see here's my pocket. And then the last step that you want to do after you've top stitched the pocket is just attach these little flappy edges on the side, because you're sewing here. Right, this is the pocket that I'm going to sew on. Because I'm sewing here, this is going to be disconnected. The side of the pocket and the side seam at the top and the bottom. So I'm just going to run a stitch inside the seam allowance there just to hold it in place. So when I go to sew the side seams, it's where it's supposed to be. But yeah, and then you end up with this really, really nice little pocket option. So it's a little different than the other pocket. It's just another variation, but I like it. So that is pocket A. That is pocket A, option pocket A. So here are our straps, all turned inside right and pressed nice and neatly. We have the seam going down the center back, so we have 2 of those. And then we're going to take the front of our garment. One thing I wanted to mention before we get going on the straps is that for this pattern, I'm making slits on the side. I'm doing the side slits. And on the pattern itself, which I cut out before I read the instructions, there are these vent strips. And these vent strips get attached to the garment. This one happens to be for the other side, but you tape these on before you cut it out. And then so you have this little jog, and then you cut this out as one piece, and that gives you more fabric to turn for your edges. So it's another way of doing them. I just turn the edges on the slits of my garment, and I'm happy with that. But certainly if you need more fabric or you want to do a double turn, then you need to attach that. And I think that's a great tool to have in your little toolbox if you have a fabric that's persnickety and needs to be double turned. So here is the front of my dress. And I have to tell you, you know, we did this stay stitching on here. I don't know about you, but I've already held this up in front of the mirror several times. And that's why we do the stay stitching, because we don't want this to get stretched out of shape. So we're going to attach our straps into the middle of the front shoulders on our pattern. And I want you to make sure that when you attach the straps that the seam is facing up, because we're going to tack these down here. We're just going to tack them with a basting stitch to go across at about 1/4 inch. We don't want to see it when we finish the seam, but think about that. It's going to go this way, right? So this is the side we want to see when we're finished. So right now we're going to tack these on here, and we want to tack them on straight because we want them to go straight up this piece. All right, so those are, after these are tacked on, we're going to take our front lining. This calls for a finish. The pattern calls for a finish on the front lining. You can do a fold down here on the hem. You can do a double fold. My lining is knit and I'm using it as a slip, so I'm just going to overlock the bottom of it, but finish the bottom edge of that hem at some way, shape, or form. And you want to take the front lining piece and put it right sides together with the front of your dress. And then we're going to pin the armhole, the neckline, and these shoulder seams. Now my suggestion is that you baste the shoulder seams when you go across here in case your strap is a little crooked. You want to stitch, so this is my armhole, you want to stitch all the way to the armhole and stitch off. Don't pivot. And then baste across the top of this shoulder seam here. Then stitch down to the V, back stitch once, stitch forward, turn. Now you have to pivot with the V, stitch once, back stitch. So you have several little back stitches right there at the crotch of that V, because we're going to have to cut this. And we want to make sure that there's enough strength there so that it doesn't fray and come apart. Then stitch back up here, stitch off across, and then go around the other side. And you're going to do the same thing for the back. So essentially we're attaching the lining to the fashion fabric at the armholes, the shoulders, and the neck edge. Now on the back piece, when you do that, leave the shoulders open, because we're going to slide the straps in there and finish that off once we decide how long we want the straps. So we have some opportunities there. This is sewn at 3/8 of an inch. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind is you want this V to be right in the center when you go back and forth, because if it's off, I mean, it's right front and center, you're going to see it. So when you pin it, I like to double check, so I'll fold, after it's all pinned, I'll fold my garment in half, just to make sure that my pin, my center pin there, is exactly in the center. Because if it's off over here just a little bit and you don't pay attention and you clip it, then you've gone way further than you want to go, and it's not a path that you want to travel down. So we're going to attach the linings to the front and the back neck edge and armholes openings, and then just across the front of the shoulder seam on the front piece. All right, we are nearing the finish on our Sauvie dress. I have sewn my armholes, my neck edge. This is the front, so I've sewn across the straps and the other armhole. Before I overlocked it, and before you do anything else, cut it or snip it, you want to turn it inside right and make sure that you're happy with the way the straps look. These can be a little bulky, so you need to try to trim some of that off. If you don't use an overlocker, then use a zigzag or something on your machine to make sure that they come out and you're happy with the way they look, and that the seam is on the other side, right? We don't want to put them on backwards. So the next thing to do, when you're happy with all of that, is you're going to take this center V seam, and this is the scary part, you're going to put a snip in it. Now on the pattern instructions, they tell you to go over this a second time, right over the stitches. I'm happy to go over it a second time. I think that's great. I mean, I overlocked mine, but don't go right over the stitches, go next to them. 2 rows of stitches on top of each other isn't going to do your fabric any good, and if it's a delicate fabric, it will help it just deteriorate faster. So I'm going to cut right into that V to the seam, but not through it. And what that does is it releases the fabric so I can actually get, once this is pressed and everything, a nice looking V. So once that's pressed, once that's understitched and pressed. After you're happy with the seams and everything looks good and you've snipped the center, then you're going to go and understitch as far as you can. You're not going to be able to make it all the way. And again, that's stitching the facing, in this case the lining, to the seam allowance. And I can show you that I got up to about here because there's no way you're going to get your machine all the way up there and then just started back again down here. So this is my back, and it looks fabulous, right? Everything's balanced. The V looks good. I'm happy with that. These are open. So now we're going to sew the dress together. So we're going to open this up. This is the back. We're going to open up the back, and we're going to open up the front and lay them right sides together. And this is your critical seam here, this underarm seam. So we want to make sure that we line that up super good, because that's going to roll to the inside of the dress. So you want to make sure that rolls really well. Then we're going to stitch the lining together. And like I said, I'm going to finish the edge of this with my overlocker, but if you've already turned the edge up a couple of times and pressed it, you want to open it up, finish the seam, and then re-roll it again. So that should be perfect because we cut them out and they fit. The pattern pieces on this garment fit really well together, so it was well drafted. Make sure that our bust dart goes down towards the hem. Now on the garment side, whenever I'm doing a long seam like this, I always pin the top and then I pin the bottom. Even though there's going to be a vent in this, I'm still going to pin the bottom because I want the bottom pieces to look like they go together, right? That's important. You don't want one longer than the other. All right, so this, look at that, that's beautiful, all right? Now, if you have sewn this extension on here, if you had pinned this on or tape this on and cut this out, you would have a flap here for your extension, and that's as far down as you would sew, and that's about where I'm going to sew mine. So I'm just going to measure this because I didn't add this on, and I'm going to put 2 pins in here because 2 pins for me tell me that's where I need to stop. So I want to make sure that from the bottom to these 2 pins is flat, and then that this section, the middle section, is flat. I'm going to match the edges up. And then I'm going to sew this big long seam. Now, if you're a little nervous, and make sure you don't catch this pocket section in there. If you're a little nervous about making this big long seam, start here at the underarm and sew down the dress, and then come back and then sew down the lining. That's perfectly fine. But we want this seam to be nice and flat without any rumples, right? And then from here, it's just a few finishing techniques. This dress is looking pretty spectacular. I just tried it on to see where I wanted to pin the straps to make it the right length. Now I made a practice garment, which you've seen, the white and black and red one. This one I downsized a little bit. The other one was a little looser than I liked. So I downsized this one just a smidge. I also wanted to try it on again and make sure that the straps were the right length. All right, here we have the front of our dress. All of my understitching is done. We've sewed up the side seams, which are absolutely lovely. I want to talk briefly about one of the notes that they have at the very end, and that is to run a stitch in the ditch, which stitches on the seam allowance of the lining and the seam allowance on the dress on the underarms for both sides. And I like that idea because it keeps it from rolling up. It's just a little bit more security. The other thing you can do if your fabric is super bouncy, if you used a crepe or something, you could do a row of top stitching. I like the cleaner look. If you don't have to do it, I would prefer not to. This fabric presses beautifully, and with the understitching, the lining actually works really well. And we've sewn all the way down the side seam of the dress and also the lining to where the slit for this one, the slit is going to be. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But right now, we want to talk about straps. We tried the straps on and made them the length that we want. So this is the back that I'm looking at now. This strap, this is the length. I put a safety pin where I wanted the strap length to be. and mine are both the same length. And what I want to do, while everything is facing up at me, so I don't end up twisting things around, is stuff this strap into the back shoulder opening there. Just gonna stuff it in there. Just so it's straight and nice like this one is, and I'm gonna throw a pin in because that's the way I want it sewn. That's not the length that I want, but that's the way I want it sewn because I have to turn this inside out and I don't want my straps to twist. So now I am going to go try to find this. Okay. And I've got a hold of the tail of my strap here. And I'm just going to take this pin out because it's easier to do it now before I turn it inside out. And there you can see there's my little tail. And then I'm going to open up, make sure that I have everything the way it's supposed to be. There we go. So now my strap is straight. It's the way I need it to be. I just need to get it to the right length. So I'm going to pull it to that safety pin. I'm going to fiddle with it a little bit. Now this safety pin is where I want the strap to end. So I need to think about moving that down a little bit because there's a seam allowance in there, right? I want to capture the seam allowance. So I'm just going to slide this strap back down just a smidge. Not much, because I'm only putting like a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance in there. There we go. Okay, I'm going to pin that. And now, because I've reorganized it on the front side, I'm confident that this is straight, and I'm going to be able to stitch this and lop off this extra. If you're worried about it not being straight and you want to try it on again, just stitch it, baste it, and then try it on again before you lop this off. But that's how easy the straps go on. It's super simple. So when you're working on the hem on something like this with a slit, you want to do the hem portion first. So I have just pressed this. I'm just going to do a double roll on my hem because this is so dark and I have white serging thread on there. And I will stitch that. I'll stitch it from this side very close to the edge because my bobbin stitch looks just as good as my top stitch, and I think that that's certainly important. Your machine they should be equal on both sides, so you can stitch it from here. I think you get a much better controlled edge stitch from here than you would on the other side because you can't see it. So once this is sewn, this hem, then you're going to go back and turn this corner. So that way when the dress opens up, you see a finished edge and not an edge of a hem. So hem first, then the side slits, and I'm just going to turn this and stitch this all the way up until I get to where my seam is, and I will stitch up past where the crotch of this seam is. So I'll stitch across and then go back down again. And if your fabric tends to ravel, or if you're worried that this is going to rip open, then you can do a little triangle or a little box there just to give you some extra security. And then I'm going to go back down the other side. And our dress is finished. It's so cute. I absolutely love this pattern. I have made two, like I said, and I can definitely see that there are more in my future. Now I did make the midi length, and it's almost floor length on me, but I'm 5'2", so take that for what it's worth. But this fabric, right, is all about this fabric. It is just gorgeous. So let's see how it looks on. This is my second Sauvie Sundress.